Good evening and welcome. And tonight I'm delighted to welcome Joe Houlihan, who's written this rather fabulous book about the Vietnam War on the big screen. So if you've watched any of these films, I'm sure you'll find this is going to be a fascinating talk. Joe, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Steve. It's great to be here.
So before we get into the book, what's your interest in military history? How did all this come about? What's your background?
Well, very briefly, my background is as a journalist. Initially, I was a newspaper journalist. And then after about 10 years of that, I moved into television production. And I've spent most of my career as a TV producer, TV executive, making documentaries and what they call non-scripted, which are the ones where you don't get big budgets and lots of actors and actresses and whatever. But the military history interest was always there. I developed it when I was very young. Became interested in the subject, read tons of books about it. Like many people of my generation, started off on Hornblower and various things, and you get interested in various subjects, and then you explore more books, and I've had that all through my life. Occasionally, I've been able to use that in my TV career. I've done sort of documentaries about the military a number of times, and then finally, when I sort of retired from television a couple of years ago, I had time to think about sort of doing something a bit more in depth with it. And well, we can talk about that maybe in a little while, but that's where I came up with the idea of looking at a particular aspect of military history that I find fascinating and looking at it through the lens of film and television, which has been my career.
And I think it will be fascinating. But you also run a literary group in Bath where you're based, don't you?
Well, yeah, there's Bath has one of those Georgian institutions I mean, the Georgians were amazing. Apart from building wonderful buildings all around the country, they set up these intellectual institutions in cities and towns all over Britain. And the one in Bath is one of the surviving ones. It's called the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution, and it celebrated its 200th birthday last year. So it's been knocking around for since 1824. When I moved to Bath about 6 or 7 years ago, I got involved with this institution, and I realised that they were doing some history talks, but not many. And there was an opportunity, with my particular interest in military history, to say, well, look, why don't we, organise talks on military history? Because the institution has a number of activities, and it has its own museum collection, but it also organises lots of talks on a whole range, everything from I almost said astrology, but I mean astronomy and science and economics and world affairs, philosophy, etc. But they didn't have much going on in history. And I suggested we start a group doing military history. It's gone on to be very successful. I organise a talk once a month with a live audience and a Zoom audience. Had some terrific speakers, including Sir Max Hastings, Jonathan Dimbleby, many others, and they tend to be, I don't want to blow my own trumpet, but they tend to be among the best attended talks we have at the institution now.
Well done, you. I'm a Gemini, if that helps your astronomy.
Yeah.
So, why the Vietnam War?
Okay, Vietnam War. I think my interest in the Vietnam War, it comes from a number of areas, but really it's that formative time of your life. The first, especially with regard to the movies, because the Vietnam War was going on when I was growing up through my sort of, as early as I can remember, really. I can remember seeing news reports on the television of stuff from Vietnam when I was just a kid. Um, as I got into my late teens, that was the period when the what I call this kind of golden age of Vietnam War movies started in 1978, with a number of movies, including The Deer Hunter and Coming Home and The Boys in Company C. And then the following year, 79, you had Apocalypse Now. Now, at that age, at that time, I was in my late teens, and I'd read a ton of books about Vietnam, and suddenly these movies were appearing. And, I was going to the cinema with my friends, watching them, and, really blown away by some of them. And I think that what's interesting is how good some of them have remained even to modern eyes, because a lot of movies I've watched a few decades ago, and I sit down to watch them with my kids and say, you must watch this, it's brilliant, and we all watch them, and I'm kind of go, it's not that good, is it? It hasn't really stood the test of time, but some of these great Vietnam ones do. So this was all kind of in my sort of moving around in my head, that I'd grown up during this period of being aware of the war. I'd seen these movies come out and seen them on the big screen, as we did at the time, And then, had my career doing TV and whatever. And at some point, the idea of bringing these together occurred to me, but also there was a sort of little question at the heart of it that had been bugging me for years. And I was always intrigued by the fact that there was a major Hollywood movie about the Vietnam War that came out in 1968 called The Green Berets, directed by and starring John Wayne. And then there wasn't another one for 10 years. There was no major Hollywood movie about the Vietnam War for a whole decade. During that decade, the Americans pulled out in 73. In 1975, the war was over and the whole of Vietnam became united under communism. And it was finally 3 years after the ending of the war itself, these movies started to appear. And I was thought, well, why is that? And that's really the starting point for the book. And to sort of maybe answer a very obvious kind of critique someone might say of that is, well, it's obvious because it was an unpopular war. Well, actually, we've had unpopular wars since, including Iraq and Afghanistan. And while those wars have gone on and been controversial at the time, the studios were still turning out movies about them. So there was something very specific about the Vietnam War that made it an area that the big studios didn't want to go near for a whole decade.
Interesting. I'll just remind our audience, if you do want to ask Joe a question, please put it in the Q&A and we will endeavour to get through as many of those later on. I just want to come back to the Green Berets with John Wayne as we're starting there. I mean, that's almost a propaganda film, isn't it? Or is that a bit harsh?
It is harsh but true, Steve. and the reason I say it's harsh, well, I'll say why it's true, first of all, because it absolutely was conceived as a propaganda film by John Wayne himself, who wrote a letter to President Lyndon Johnson saying, look, there's this war going on over on the far side of the world. Our boys are fighting to stop the tide of communism, because John Wayne was famously quite a Republican. I mean, during the McCarthyite, during the witch hunts against Senator McCarthy, witch hunts in Hollywood in the 1950s, when lots of Hollywood writers and actors and directors were being kind of accused of being fellow travelers of the communists, John Wayne was cheering on the witch hunters. He was like, yeah, go get them. And so he really believed in this. He was very right wing. He believed in stopping communism. He wrote to President Lyndon Johnson with a very kind of homespun letter saying, it starts off with something like, my pa always used to say, if you want something done, go to the top man. So I'm writing to you, Mr. President. It's very, you could hear, I can't do John Wayne's voice, but you can hear it through this letter.
You've got to ask yourself who thought they were the top man in that conversation.
Very good one. Yeah, very good question. So the reason, and in the letter, he specifically says the purpose of this film will be to gain support for our war in Vietnam. So clearly a proposition to have a propaganda film. And the White House, unsurprisingly, who were doubling down on Vietnam at the time, said yes, they would support his film. The reason it's harsh is that from John Wayne's point of view, he was just doing what he'd always done. He, before the Second World War, he'd been the absolutely archetypal male screen hero of Hollywood, in his cowboy roles. And of course, when the Second World War started, that role transferred very easily into World War II films. And he made a number of World War II films, including, I'm sure many of the people watching this will have seen some of them, Sands of Iwo Jima, The Fighting Seabees. I think he may have been in The Longest Day. So he was in these films. And these films, of course, during the Second World War were also propagandistic, not in a simple, very simplistic way, but they were about heroic Americans taking on an evil enemy and defeating them, whether it be the Nazi Germans or the Imperial Japanese. So this is why I'm saying it's slightly harsh, is that for what John Wayne thought he was doing is, because they did the same during the Korean War. And in fact, during the Second World War, Hollywood brought out 150 movies about the war while the war was being fought. That's pretty impressive, especially as the Americans arrived a bit late. And then in the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, even in that war, they managed to produce 22 movies about the Korean War, and they all had sort of titles like "Retreat," "Hell," and they were very gung ho, jingoistic movies. But it was what the Hollywood did. Our nation is at war, albeit far away on the other side of the world. We need to support the troops. So John Wayne just thought, well, we're in another war now in Vietnam. Hollywood's will do its thing again, and I think he just assumed that his movie would go ahead, and other studios would follow suit, and there'd be more movies of the same. So propaganda, yes, but for John Wayne, just doing what he always did.
Did it receive good critical acclaim? What was the sort of response from the critics, but I guess more importantly, audiences?
Well, actually, two different responses. The audiences it did pretty well with audiences in the cinema, particularly outside of the big cities, particularly in Middle America, because for them it was another John Wayne action flick. Yeah, so they knew what they were going to get. They were going to get a square-jawed American hero leading American good guys to fight baddies. And on that level, it works fine as a film. It's just an adventure film. In the big cities, some of the cinemas were picketed by anti-war protesters. All the main reviewers absolutely hated it. I mean, they called words like vile and reprehensible were used in reviews, and they thought it was incredibly jingoistic. They thought it dehumanized the Vietnamese in it, and to some extent, so I have a little bit of sympathy for John Wayne, as you can probably tell, partly because he was just doing what he always did, but also because when he got the green light to make that film, it was 1966, and yes, there were major troop deployments had been made to Vietnam by then. They started in 1965, but it was relatively early in the war, and things could have gone better from the American point of view. No one knew what was going to happen, and I think a lot of Americans thought, well, once we commit to this war with our firepower and our superior sort of technology and also our superior moral values, it'll be over quickly and we'll sort it out. Well, just because of the vagaries of making a Hollywood movie, it took 2 years for that film to get on screen. And in that too, partly because they were wrangling back and forth about the script, then one of the studio that was going to back it changed its mind and another studio came in. This is standard Hollywood movie stuff, but it took 2 years. So by the time that movie hits the screen in 1968, we've had the Tet Offensive, where the Vietnamese and the Viet Cong communist guerrillas and the North Vietnamese army, 80,000 of them attack across the whole of South Vietnam, including getting into the American embassy in Saigon. So the idea that the war was on the verge of being won had been blown away at the beginning of 1968. 1968 was also the year when the My Lai massacre happened. I mean, it didn't actually become public knowledge till the following year, but the stories were beginning to filter through that maybe we weren't always the good guys from an American perspective. They weren't always, this wasn't going the way you would hope a war would go. And it wasn't a simple moral binary like the Second World War, where everyone could feel, we are the good guys and they really are the bad guys. So basically, when it hit the screens, it was into very challenging headwinds. And although it did okay at the box office, the Hollywood executives, they looked more at the reviews from the influential reviewers, and they looked more at the sort of protests held outside the cinemas, and they just thought, we're not going anywhere near Vietnam.
You had all the anti-war protests. You also had civil rights protests as well, which I wouldn't say all merged, but there was an awful lot going on in the United States at the time, wasn't there?
Well, famously a period of incredible social upheaval. And what's interesting is how that impacted the Vietnam War, and it impacted the attitudes towards the Vietnam War. It impacted the way the Vietnam War was fought. And at the same time, the Vietnam War was feeding back into those social upheavals that were going on throughout America. I mean, I've got a chapter in the book about the African American experience of being in Vietnam, and it was one of those things that you had some states still didn't have full civil rights for African Americans back in America, yet these guys were in the jungle in Vietnam fighting and dying for America.
Mm. So it obviously got caught out by what was the changing social fabric, the changing situation in the war. How many years did you say it was then before another Vietnam War film was made?
So for an actual Hollywood, I call them major Hollywood movies because there were other minor things that came and went and no one paid any attention to. But for a major Hollywood movie, it was a full decade. It was 10 years from the release of the Green Berets, 1968 to 1978. I call it the Great Vietnam Movie Drought. And there were reasons for that. These are the reasons that the Hollywood just looked at the reaction to the Green Berets and ran a mile.
Yeah. But was there more to it than that? Because that sounds like an awful long time for to stay out of commenting on it, and also, I mean, obviously, it would have been ripe for telling stories. But did they feel more pressured by the social fabric of America at the time?
Yeah, I think the country felt so divided.
Yeah,
I just gain an idea of it. Those of us who've lived through the Brexit debates here and after the Brexit vote in Britain, in the ensuing years, we've seen a country really, it feels like half the country are against the other half, and some really unpleasant kind of back and forth, and people unfriending people and not wanting to, and cutting off relatives because they had a different viewpoint. I think it was a bit like that in America during the Vietnam, especially during the late 60s and early and sort of 1970, 71. The support for the war had initially been fairly strong as early as like 64, 65. But as the 60s wore on, that support drained away. But there was still a residual fair chunk of people who thought, yeah, we've got to be there stopping the domino effect of communism worldwide. But you ended up with the country completely divided. I think the Hollywood execs thought, well, whatever movie we make, we're going to piss off half the audience.
yeah.
And they just didn't.
Couldn't get their return on it, I guess, or thought
Yeah.
they couldn't get their return on it. So, what was the next major Hollywood movie?
So the real biggie, which 10 years after Green Berets in 1978, the real biggie was The Deer Hunter. That was the one that kind of opened the floodgates, I think. But there were three other movies that came out that year. There's one called Coming Home, which was very much an anti-war film. It was Jane Fonda's idea. Jane Fonda, your audience may know, was a very active campaigner against the war. She even went to Hanoi in North Vietnam during the war, and she was known as
Hanoi Jane, I think
Hanoi
they called
Jane
her, didn't
thereafter.
they?
Yeah, exactly. So she was very unpopular with those people who still supported prosecuting the war. But that was interestingly, the Deer Hunter. Again, I'll assume most of the audience watching this have seen The Deer Hunter, but yeah, The Deer Hunter is to my mind, a classic film. And actually, it's a film about Vietnam, but it's also not. The first hour of you don't get to Vietnam until over an hour into the film. The first hour is just following this bunch of blue collar guys in Philadelphia who then end up shipping out to Vietnam. There's very little war movie in it, because as soon as they're in Vietnam, the next thing you see is the four guys have been captured by the Viet Cong, and they're being forced to play Russian roulette as a kind of form of torture, really, by their captors. They turn the tables, they escape, but in various ways, they're all screwed up by what happens thereafter. And it ends up. I hope I'm not going to give spoilers to anyone who hasn't seen it. But one of the four is so screwed up by the Russian roulette games that he ends up in a kind of drug-fueled Saigon underworld playing Russian roulette for money. That film looked at the psychological damage of being in the Vietnam War. Coming Home, the Jane Fonda one, very briefly, the story of that is she's a nice, dutiful wife married to a guy who enlists in the Viet, a very hole up his backside, patriotic guy who enlists to fight in Vietnam. Goes to Vietnam. While he's away, she falls in love with a wheelchair-bound Vietnam veteran played by John Voight, who's lost the use of his legs from a wounds taken in Vietnam. But he has, since coming back, he has become an anti-war activist. So she gradually falls in love with him, and that's the gist of the story. So the Deer Hunter, you had psychological damage of the war. Coming Home, you had the physical damage of the war, represented by wheelchair-bound John Voight. What was interesting is that two other Vietnam War movies came out in 1978 that were more overtly about the combat. There's one called The Boys in Company C, which is a really good film, and Go Tell the Spartans, which was a Burt Lancaster movie, and they were both set in Vietnam and were combat films. Now they also carried anti-war messages. They weren't as simplistic. They weren't the Green Berets. But what's interesting is the two films that did brilliantly at the box office were Coming Home and The Deer Hunter. The other two barely raised a ripple. And my view on this is that by the time the American people came back to be willing enough to watch movies about Vietnam, they did not want to watch movies about fighting. They wanted to watch movies about the trauma and damage of war. And I think that's why the two that did well, and why the other two didn't. In fact, the guy, the director of The Boys in Company C said later, about 10 years later, he said that my film, because most people now agree it's a really, really good film. But he said my film was 10 years too early. It took another decade after 78 before there was a smash hit of a movie that was about fighting the Vietnam War.
Mm. So the Deer Hunter, I think, am I right in saying, was quite groundbreaking in the fact that the way it dealt with the trauma of fighting in a war. That obviously, and that's, I don't know of any other films. I'm not a film expert, so I'm sure you can fill the gaps here. But I thought that was one of the most groundbreaking things, and it's quite a dark film, isn't it? I know it's obviously dealing with really serious issues, but it has I don't know, a melancholia almost running through it, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, even up until the final scenes. It's one of those films that I saw it when it came out in 1978, and I remembered it as being brilliant. And then when I rewatched it, I hadn't watched it again for probably getting on what 78, 88, 90, 4 decades. I watched it after 4 decades while researching this book. And at the end, I was blown away. I think it's just an amazing film, and it is melancholy. It's actually not as it's not as yeah, clearly it's an anti-war film, but
Mm.
it's not a simplistic anti-war film. There's a scene at the very end, which is an amazing scene where the guy who's become drug addicted and playing Russian roulette eventually dies, not unsurprisingly when you're playing Russian roulette, and they brought his body home to Pennsylvania. And his friends, including his comrades like Robert De Niro, who was one of the actors who plays one of the other soldiers, and the various friends and family have gathered together in a restaurant after his funeral, and they start singing "God Save America," um, "God Bless America." I mean, they start singing "God Bless America," and that was very controversial at the time because again, this divide in the country, half the, well, not half, a lot of people in the audience thought that was mocking the loss, the tragedy of the people who died. They thought it was meant to be a sarcastic, ironic. Why would God bless the country who participated in this war with all the horrors that we've just been watching for the last 2.5 hours? Another big chunk of the audience thought it was a deliberately patriotic, uplifting, bad things may have happened, but God bless America because we're trying to do the right thing. So even that was divisive. And in fact, the director, Cimino, he says it was meant to be neither. It was meant to be an emotional outpouring from a group of people who are grieving a loss. But take what you will from it. You're right. The tone of that film is melancholy, dramatic, very, an amazing watch. I would say to anyone here who hasn't watched it, it's worth seeing.
So, because I knew we were doing this talk, I've watched a fair number of Vietnam War films. You'd be pleased to know, but The Deer
Oh,
Hunter
good.
is one of them. So I will add that to my list and give that a watch. I do remember it being very melancholic, and I probably saw it about the same length of time ago last time I saw it. So we'll come back to that. I will come back to that. So 1979. What came out in 1979? It's not
Uh,
a
the,
question.
the big one.
The big one.
Yeah. Well, Apocalypse Now, I think was so Francis Ford Coppola. So the floodgates have opened in 78, 79 comes Apocalypse Now, which admittedly Coppola had been working on it for several years, but and that to me, if I'm pushed to give an answer, I say that The Deer Hunter I think is the best Vietnam War film, although you may consider it not to be even to be a Vietnam War film. Um, but Apocalypse Now is undoubtedly the big daddy of Vietnam War films, just because of the impact it's had culturally, and it's in the zeitgeist. The most people know phrases like "I love the smell of napalm in the morning," and most people have an image in their head of a bunch of helicopters flying over the sea with "Ride of the Valkyries," by Wagner blaring from side-mounted speakers. It's an absolutely extraordinary film, and as the story behind it's fascinating as well. It really, that shoot, yeah, talk about a doomed movie shoot. Yeah, Francis Ford Coppola went to the Philippines to shoot that movie. I think he planned something like 50 days shoot. It took 234. They had a hurricane that destroyed all their sets. Their lead actor, Martin Sheen, had a heart attack and nearly died. Um, Coppola himself uh, contemplated suicide. It went so over budget that he had to mortgage his vineyard in California. Hey, first world problems. You mortgage your vineyard, but he had to mortgage his vineyard, mortgage his house, and mortgaged his residual profits in The Godfather because he directed The Godfather and The Godfather Part Two. He did all that to get enough money to finish the film. and there was a civil war going on at the same time as well. In fact, when they were filming their helicopter scenes, they had to do them a number of times because at least twice, as they're doing that Ride of the Valkyries series, they were using real Filipino army helicopters and army pilots. And a couple of times they got told to break off to go and sort of strafe some rebel outpost somewhere. So it was an incredible shoot. But they got there in the end, and what you've ended up with is a film which, again, it's not. We may talk about other movies like Platoon later on, which are a traditional war film about battles in that war. I mean, heaven only knows what Apocalypse Now is. It's based on a novel by Joseph Conrad, set a 19th century novel about an ivory trader in the Congo in Africa. So it's inspired by that. There's elements of Homer's Odyssey in it, but there's just so many set piece scenes in it, and so many memorable lines and memorable characters that I think it sort of. I think when most people think of a Vietnam War movie now, that's the one they think of.
Hmm. I'm not sure it's a Vietnam War movie.
Yeah, yeah.
I think it's obviously an exploration of the darker side of humanity, isn't it? That's obviously the river is the metaphor for that, as in Joseph Conrad's book. And obviously the moment at the end, well, no spoilers, but it's a very dramatic ending by any stretch of the imagination. And I think, is it a Vietnam War movie? It's certainly not like any of the others, is it?
Yeah, it's often been said it's not a Vietnam War movie. On the other hand, it is because it has some great scenes of Vietnam War, and interestingly, I think the Robert Duvall scenes are the most famous. And Robert Duvall, the actor who just died last week,
Yeah.
Played Colonel Kilgore in the Ride of the Val. Again, Kilgore, get it? Like, you couldn't be more obvious about what they were trying to say about his character, but he played that character. That character is based on a real person. Yeah, that character is based on a guy called Stockton, who wore a cavalry hat and played Wagner on his helicopters going into combat, and carried his papers in saddlebags because they were the air cavalry, and they liked to look back to their roots of the 19th century horse soldiers of the plains. So that there is a lot of Vietnam in it, but it's not. I think ultimately it's not a Vietnam War movie. It's trying to say something else, and you're absolutely right. It's about the same story as in Conrad's book, which is epitomized by Marlon Brando's character, Colonel Kurtz, towards the end of the movie, which is about the thin veneer of civilization. The idea is that we think we're civilized, but if we go far enough up the river, far enough into the unknown, into the wild jungle, how long can we cling to that civilization, and will we be able to keep it with us, or will we lose it and become what the jungle is? I have this theory, you see, because in the Green Berets, John Wayne is a Green Beret colonel. In Apocalypse Now, Marlon Brando's character Kurtz was a Green Beret colonel, and I like this idea that they're sort of the same man in a different way. So John Wayne is a Green Beret colonel in 1966, full of hope and optimism. We're going to help the poor Vietnamese people resist communism. By 1979, he's represented by Kurtz, who's gone up there full of all the best ideals, and actually he hasn't conquered the jungle or conquered the uncivilized. They've conquered him, and he's become part of that uncivilized world.
I think there might be something in that, because when they're talking about him, when they terminate his command with extreme prejudice, see, he had an exemplary record, didn't he? And that's what Willard was looking at, the main protagonist of the film. I could talk about Apocalypse Now forever. I've got books on this because I showed you the other day.
Yeah.
But we don't have time. What's your next movie of choice to talk about?
Oh, I could talk. Well, so many I could talk about. I think probably in terms of narrative development, if you like, for how the Vietnam War played out in moviedom, you've got to go to Platoon, which comes out in 1986. So this is 8 years after the ending of the Great Vietnam War movie drought.
A long time after Apocalypse Now as well. So it didn't, interestingly, such a controversial film at the time, Apocalypse Now didn't necessarily help, did it?
It did, but it helped. I think Oliver Stone, who wrote and directed Platoon, had been touting that script around from the late 70s.
Right.
I think by the time Apocalypse Now comes out in 79 and through 80, it's becoming a sensation. studios start to think, oh, we better have a Vietnam film of our own. And eventually, Platoon comes on a few years after that. But I think that's when the conversations about green lighting Platoon started to get serious for Oliver Stone. And the reason Platoon is important is because it is generally considered to be the first Vietnam War. In fact, you say Apocalypse Now is not a Vietnam War movie. Well, I'll tell you who agree with you, Steve, apart from me, obviously, but is pretty much all the veterans who fought in the Vietnam War. So they had enjoyed quite a few of the Vietnam War movies that came out. They enjoyed The Deer Hunters. Some did, some didn't. But they enjoyed Apocalypse Now as a piece of entertainment. Platoon was the first one where they sat down in the movie theatre, eating their popcorn, chatting to their mates. The movie started, and within 3 minutes, their chins on the floor, and they're broken out in a cold sweat, because that's the first movie that makes them feel like it's real. It's their experience. They're on the big screen in front of them, and they actually, some of them even start having flashbacks to their time in Vietnam while they're sitting in the theatre. And there's a good story behind why that is. An obvious answer is, well, Oliver Stone, the director, he was the first Vietnam War movie director who'd actually served in Vietnam. And not only had he served in Vietnam, he'd served with distinction. He'd won an award for bravery. He'd served as an infantryman. He'd done long range patrolling, which was pretty dangerous and deadly. So he really had experienced the Vietnam War up front and personally. He said he was one of the few soldiers he knew who saw what a man he killed, because he was with a platoon that started taking fire. There were two platoons, two US platoons, infantry platoons. They started taking fire. They sort of hunkered down to return fire, and then they started taking fire from inside their cordon. And apparently, this was a fairly common Viet Cong trick, which was to sort of have a pit somewhere with a guy hidden in it. And once the fighting started, he would pop up and start shooting at the Americans from behind, in the hope that they would then turn and start shooting on each other, which sometimes happened. Anyway, Stone happened to I think the lieutenant was either killed or wounded. I think the sergeant was down. So they didn't, on Stone's platoon, there wasn't anyone in charge, but he saw this guy, he saw where this Viet Cong guy was shooting from, and he got up and ran across and lobbed a grenade into the pit where the guy ran and killed him. But he said he then saw the guy's body. It was very unusual, especially for those involved in fighting in the jungle, to see the people you killed. So he was a storied, a medal, awarded hero of Vietnam in many ways. He also was an anti-war. Actually, he was very anti-war. And anyway, so he decided he wanted to make this film about the war called Platoon. Meanwhile, there was a US Marine 3-tour veteran called Captain Dale Dye, who'd just retired from the military a few years earlier. And he had a bugbear in that he hated war films, because having served 3 tours in Vietnam, being a very experienced military man, he just thought every time he watched a war film, it just looked so unreal. And it didn't feel realistic to him. And he came up with this idea that if he could go to Hollywood and persuade people to let him train actors on how to really look and feel like soldiers, it would help the movies. And he spent a year touting this idea around Hollywood, couldn't get a look in. People didn't want to know. Hollywood's a very conservative industry, so why would we listen to this? What, he's an army guy? He wants to do what? Yeah, forget it. But then he read a single paragraph in one of the Hollywood trade magazines saying a Vietnam veteran called Oliver Stone is going to be making a movie about Vietnam. He managed to somehow blag a 3-minute meeting with Oliver Stone, during which he made his pitch. Oliver Stone was non-committal. So Dale Dye went away thinking, right, that's it. After a year, if I can't even get the Vietnam vet to see what I'm talking about, what's the point? The next day, he got a call saying, Oliver Stone wants you to come back for another meeting. So then he persuaded, from then it was all go, and Dale Dye persuaded Stone to let him have the entire cast of 33 people for a 3-week-long boot camp in the Philippines before they shot Platoon. And what he did, so Dale Dye got a few of his veteran colleagues, and they took these guys into the jungle, and they absolutely brutalized them for these 3 weeks. They made them march with 75 pounds on their back through hot, over 100 degrees humidity. They ambushed them. They made them eat MREs, meals ready to eat, which gave them all constipation. They just gave them a terrible time. And all this, they were not allowed to use their real names. They all had to use the name of their character in the movie, but they weren't being filmed. This was, Oliver Stone wasn't there. This was just the actors being made to suffer. They were every night. They would be for 2 hours sleep, 2 hours off, because that's what you would have done if you were on patrol, on any kind of patrol out in the jungle in Vietnam. You would not get to suffer. Oh, it's been a hard day's filming, walking through the jungle. I'll have my 8 hours now.
Yeah.
No chance. So they really, and these guys hated it at first. These actors. I mean, it included, Johnny Depp, a young Johnny Depp. There was Tom Berenger, Willem Dafoe, Charlie Sheen. Charlie Sheen, of course, who'd been in the Philippines 10 years earlier, while his dad Martin was making Apocalypse Now. Now Charlie was back doing Platoon. So
he's a
seen
sucker
all
for punishment, isn't he?
He certainly was. Having seen what his dad went through, God, It's amazing he went back. Anyway, to cut a long story short, towards the end, these guys, of course, what inevitably happens, and anyone who's done military training won't be surprised by this, they start to bond. They start to work together against the instructors. They start to have the instructors are the enemy. They start to and they're they become family. And in the final couple of days, they divided them into two and they sent them off to various coordinates in the jungle. And one lot, they gave them deliberately the wrong coordinates, so they got completely lost and they had no instructors with them. And these guys who were lost, they managed to make camp, build fires. They found pineapples and bananas, and they just had a great night. And they came and they eventually marched back in military sort of fashion the following day to the rendezvous point. And it was like they were a military unit by then. And I know you're not a real military unit. You haven't taken fire. You haven't really been, at risk of death. Although, having said that, Willem Dafoe almost died from drinking kind of contaminated river water, and Captain Dale died when the guy who plays the medic in the movie was the only medic they had. Needless to say, called Doc. When Doc, an actor called Paul Sanchez, went to Dale Dye and said, Willem Dafoe's, I think he might die, he's really ill. Captain Dye said to him, do the best you can. That was because his point being, if this was real, you'd have to do the best you can. And anyway, obviously he lived because he shot the film. When they finished that final, after that sort of, when they got lost in the jungle and they managed to sort of come together and they had a brilliant time bonding, they realized they could do it. They all got back to base camp and they all had a kind of a rap party, celebrated a rap party, and they all drank loads of a drink called lampanog, which is Filipino palm liquor. And they all got plastered on this. And at 6 a.m. the next morning, Dale Dye and Oliver Stone appeared and said, on your feet, we start filming in an hour. And they made them patrol through the jungle, hungover, having just finished this boot camp. And when you see that is in the opening few minutes of Platoon, you see very brief scene of plane arriving in Vietnam, guys disembarking, and it cuts straight to the jungle. You see Charlie Sheen and others walking through, and they look like, SH-1T. They look terrible. And the reason is partly because they'd just been through this boot camp that made it look authentic, but also they were completely hungover. But it was also the attention to detail wasn't just about brutalizing the cast to make them look more like a military unit. It was also apparently all the tiny little things, the way their uniforms were worn, the things that were frayed and the things that were written on them, the way they wore them were all 100% what would have been the way it was in Vietnam, which is why when veterans watched that movie and sat down, they just were absolutely stunned, when they watched it. And actually it started a whole trend in authenticity in war movies and did very well for Captain Dye, because his company called Warriors Inc. since went on to be the kind of the sort of expert advisors for everything from Saving Private Ryan to Forrest Gump to Band of Brothers and too many to mention.
He's a really interesting character as well. There's some good interviews of him, isn't there, on YouTube and the internet?
Oh, some great interviews. He's a crazy character. Really
good value for an interview.
And he was nice, because I spent a lot of time with him for in researching the book, and he was very generous with his time, but also very he said, because his company even started branching out into. And he ended up doing military advisors for sci-fi films and and ancient history. I think he did Troy, but his view was, well, look, fighting men are fighting men, and the way they are is the same. But You have other people who research exactly the equipment that a Greek warrior from 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago might have worn. But in terms of how they behave, he still had that boot camp approach to the actors.
Mm. I must admit, because I rewatched Platoon, and as you know, I've interviewed several Vietnam veterans, but one of them, Ed Mann, he was a point man in Vietnam, and he spent a good deal of time explaining what it was like to be in a jungle. What was that like? How did it feel? You know, the senses, the smells, the canopy, all the rest of it. When he told me all of that from first-hand experience, you could see what they were doing in Platoon. I had much more sense of it, if you see what I mean. So I guess from the point of view, can you convey what it's like to fight in a jungle on a 2D screen? I can see that they must have put an awful lot of effort into it. I mean, clearly it's never going to be the same, but yeah, I think a very well.
No, I think you're right, Steve. And I listened to that, watched that Ed Mann interview, which is a terrific interview. And I was struck by the fact that, he said he was, before he went to Vietnam, he was quite an outdoorsman back in America. So he was comfortable in the woods and and obviously in North America, there are things that can harm you in the woods in North America. But his description of being in the woods, being in the jungle, when the layers of everything that you can't see more than a few yards ahead of you a lot of the time, and it must have been absolutely perilous because I've never had to experience anything like that. You sort of imagine, well, if I was leading point, through the jungle of Vietnam, my eyes and ears I'd be so alert. But then as soon as you got in there, you realize, you're having to hack through foliage, right in front of you. Your ability to the idea that you could go through there with, like a radar kind of looking out for trouble. No, you're dealing with the sweat running down your face. You're dealing with the insects that's just dropped onto your head. You're dealing with the snake on the tree. You're dealing with the fact that you can't see more than 2 yards. And I thought his talk with you was fantastic for bringing that alive.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it was a real insight. We haven't got much time. We've definitely got some comments and questions that we need to get through. So, and one audience member I will go through this because it would probably help us choose the next film to talk about. Good Morning Vietnam. I should probably say that slightly differently. It's my favorite Vietnam War film. The music soundtrack, together with a tremendous part played by the late, great Robin Williams, is unsurpassed. That's a question from Andrew. So, shall we talk about Good Morning Vietnam?
Yeah, I mean, good morning, Andrew. Thank you for that. I agree. It's a wonderful film, and Robin Williams was amazing in it. And of course, based on a real guy, Adrian Cronauer the character he plays was a real person. He was an Air Force enlisted man who spent a year, and he really did have Good Morning Vietnam as his call sign. Of course, a lot of after that, a lot of what happens in the film is fiction rather than fact. But he did run up against officialdom and who wanted him to play boring middle of the road music, and the real Adrian Cronauer was he was in with the vibe of the times. He wanted to play the Doors and the Rolling Stones or whatever. So he was controversial at the time. Although he does say that he heard from one trooper that his show started at 6 a.m. every morning, and with his famous cry of "Good Morning Vietnam" at the top of his voice. And he did meet one trooper once who said that he'd just come back from like a 3-day patrol and just got to sleep when "Good Morning Vietnam," and the guy took his M16 out and shot up the radios. But no, terrific film. And actually, I use that in my book. I'm plugging my book here, but I use that in a
That's
chapter
why we're
about.
here, Joe. That's
Very
perfectly
good.
allowed.
There it is. Look, in a book about the role of music. Because actually, it's a very interesting point. The music in these Vietnam War films was completely different to what had come before. War films up until and including the Green Berets in 1968. When you had a war film, the director would film it, they would edit it together, and then they'd give it to a composer to write a music score. And of course they'd some great music scores. Lots of us will know, The Great Escape and the Dam Busters, and they become very memorable. But it was the way it was done. From 1978, 79 onwards, you start getting movies where all the music is pop music of the time. It's rock music of the time because that's what the guys in Vietnam were listening to. And there is, in fact, if you go on Spotify, if you have Spotify or Apple Music now, and you just type in Vietnam playlist, you will get a playlist that is of the songs people were listening to during the Vietnam War. But really, it's a playlist of the songs that have been in the movies made about the Vietnam War. So it's fascinating. And of course, a whole bunch of great songs appear in Good Morning Vietnam.
And also because that relates to the period, I guess, that of the Vietnam War, which was obviously a very important period in terms of music itself, pop. So
Mm.
it kind of got, obviously films are pop culture, but it wove itself into the sort of the music of the times in a way that other genres, if that's the right phrase, of films perhaps didn't. And that's where the trend started. Was that fair to say?
Yeah, completely. And of course, yeah, it's now absolutely familiar. If you watch a war movie now, and there'll be, there's movies about the Iraq War that, there's lots of hip hop or whatever the current music the guys would have been listening to. We don't even notice it's normal now. It's just,
Mm.
but it wasn't normal when these movies came out in 78, 79, and 86, the early 80s. And exactly what you say, Steve, is that at the time of the Vietnam War, the music was influencing the guys out in Vietnam. They were there listening to these songs that were, songs like when when you're facing, great danger every day in your job, and you come home and you're listening to like "Give Me Shelter" or there's a guy, there's a man with a gun in his hands, the stuff that all along the Watchtower. These songs seem to sort of speak directly to you. And so that influences, but also that influences a lot of the troopers' view of the war. They're
Mm.
listening to songs that clearly are anti-war while they're in fighting this war, and that filters back to the States. It's a real kind of Atlantic gyre of kind of influence going. Everything influences itself in a kind of circular motion.
So in Good Morning Vietnam, he wasn't allowed to play anything by Bob Dylan. I wonder why.
Yeah,
At least in the
exactly.
film,
Yeah,
that's what they said
yeah,
anyway.
yeah.
Gary says, MASH, the film came out in about 1970. Isn't this an early proxy for the Vietnam War, chaps? I know it's meant to be Korea, but a large part of the later TV series audience thought it was Vietnam rather than Korea.
Is that Gary? Is it?
Yes, Gary. Yep.
Gary, top marks, Gary. I've got a chapter in my book called Camouflage because in this great Vietnam War movie Drought between 1968 and 1978, actually, there were a few Vietnam War films that came out, but they were allegories. They weren't set in Vietnam. So perhaps one of the best known is Soldier Blue, which is about US cavalry in the 19th century in the plains fighting Native Americans. And there's a massacre in Soldier Blue, which is almost identical to the My Lai massacre. And then MASH is absolutely a Vietnam film that was disguised as a Korean War film. In fact, when that film was kind of close to the end of production, the studio got so nervous about it, people mistaking it for a Vietnam War film, that they insisted that the public address system announcements if you've seen the film recently, you'll remember every now and then, and they did it in the TV series as well. They have this public address system and they make announcements over it. The studio executive said that every time they did one of these announcements, they had to refer to it being in Korea because they didn't want the audience to think it was a Vietnam film. But of course, everyone in the audience took it as it was about Vietnam. And again, it was quite an anti-war message because you've got surgeons basically dealing with the aftermath of war. So it was a powerful film, a great film actually.
Mm. Yeah, I agree.
And
Patrick
my
says,
name, I have to say with my namesake in it because Major Hot Lips Houlihan.
I'll have to write that down to remember that one, although I'm probably never going to forget it. Now it's immortalized, will be immortalized on YouTube. So Patrick says, this is quite a long one, but I want to read this. Have always loved Vietnam movies. My father worked for the United Nations and we lived in Saigon from 73 to 75. We were evacuated when my dad went through the fall of Saigon. He saw the Viet Cong tanks rolling in and was lifted by the US Marines in a Huey off the building across the road from the US Embassy. He ended up on the aircraft carrier Midway. He always spoke of the helicopters landing and getting shoved off the deck into the Bay of Siam. As a kid, I can remember jets being shot down at night over Saigon, being in the market when South Vietnamese fighter pilots defected, bombed the presidential palace, missed and hit the market, and also seeing trucks full of wounded soldiers, all a long time ago, but still quite vivid. Patrick, thank you so much for sharing that. I imagine that is extremely vivid. I don't know if you have a favorite Vietnam War film, or if you hang on, sorry, I've realized you've followed that up. So Patrick goes on to say, I believe that a lot of the atmospheric footage in Platoon, the mist in the bamboo forest and the tiger bit were just bought in from National Geographic, as shooting them would have been tough and expensive. Well, tigers probably would be quite tough, I guess. But Patrick, in all seriousness, thank you so much for sharing that, because that is indeed the reason why we do this is to get stories like that out there.
Wow, what an experience. That's absolutely incredible. I mean, that's being one of the great kind of pivoting points of history in the last sort of 50 years, really. Um, and the Tiger, yeah, the Tiger, I just don't mean to correct anyone, but that was in Apocalypse Now, the Tiger scene. He jumps out at the guy called Chef, and it gets shot by Martin Sheen.
I can remember that now you've said that. I haven't rewatched
Yeah.
Apocalypse Now yet. So, Patrick, thank you so much for that. Andrew has actually sent a message to Patrick effectively. Good to have you on board. Is there anyone else with us? There are, but they may not be saying anything. Andrew, don't forget Full Metal Jacket. There's so many not to forget, but since you've said it, we can talk about it. The part played by R. Lee Ermey, if I'm pronouncing that
Me.
right, who was, I believe, a real drill sergeant, was brilliant. The sort of drill sergeant one could only dream about if one had to go to war. Let's talk
Yeah,
about
I
Full
agree.
Metal
Yeah,
Jacket.
Full Metal Jacket, directed by Stanley Kubrick, obviously a very famous director. R. Lee Ermey was a real Marine drill instructor. And interestingly, if you were with us earlier, I was talking about a film that came out in 1978 called The Boys in Company C. And in that movie, that's very similar to Full Metal Jacket in that it starts with a boot camp training, Marine Corps training, and the drill instructor in that film is played by R. Lee Ermey again. So he plays in that he plays the identical role, sort of 10 years earlier in The Boys in Company C, which again I would recommend if you haven't seen it. It was too early. That film was too early for the taste of the American audience in 1978. They weren't ready for that. As we discussed earlier, they wanted films about the pain and the trauma of war at that point, not the kind of fighting of the war. And Ermey was absolutely brilliant as the drill instructor in Full Metal Jacket as well. Of course, because he was playing himself. He was just doing what he did in his real life. The one big critique of Full Metal Jacket is that it's about a group of Marines going to fight and during the Tet Offensive, and they fight in the Battle of Hue, which was a historic city in sort of middle of South Vietnam. For that film, Kubrick used a disused gasworks in London as Hue. So there has been some critiques that it didn't look anything like the ancient historical former capital of Vietnam. But it's a pretty good film.
It's definitely a film of two halves, though, isn't it? I mean, there's
Oh,
the whole training half. It may not be actually half, and then there's obviously the combat scenes. And I think that's what makes it quite different from the others, isn't it? How it focuses on what is effectively brutal training, and what impact does that then have on the Marines and when they're deployed.
yeah, and I think that's why the director of The Boys in Company C was disappointed because his film is almost the same. So half of it is the training, and then half of it is combat in Vietnam. But I thought Full Metal Jacket worked very well. It's interesting because
Mm.
even though you're not plunged into the war zone straight away, you get that, but you certainly get to know all the characters, and you get to know. I mean, it's quite shocking at times the training set, well, how it all ends up in the training, but.
Well, and also I think for those that don't know Vietnam or certainly didn't serve there, a lot of them will. One veteran I interviewed talked about the idea of a shake and bake sergeant. So they were quite, because obviously these were nearly everybody serving there was only there for a year unless they
Yeah.
wanted to go back. So they were all short timers, I think they called them. So, you were literally getting a very small amount of training before being deployed to Southeast Asia, of all places, in the middle of a jungle. So mightily challenging circumstances, I think.
Yeah, and I think that was true with officers as well. I think a
Yeah.
lot of troopers felt it was pot luck whether you got a lieutenant who frankly knew what he was doing or one who didn't. And if you had one who didn't, it could be cause the death of quite a few people in the
Mm.
platoon. So it was and famously there were stories of fragging officers and this kind of thing if they thought they were completely incompetent. I mean, I think there are some known examples of that, but probably more of them are apocryphal than real, I would suggest.
Joe, we've only got 5 minutes left. We've got a few questions. You all right to stay for another
Hmm.
few
Yeah,
minutes
yeah,
beyond
sure.
beyond 8 o'clock? Cool. Thank you very much. Gary goes on to say, who asked earlier, he says, "Thank you for your excellent response. I have not thought of Soldier Blue verse as a Vietnam film. Makes so much sense now." It's good to hear you're making sense, Joe.
First time for everything,
Yeah,
Steve.
you never know. You heard it here first. Gary goes on to say, "I really didn't like Full Metal Jacket due to the portrayal of Private Pile character. An obese fool who appears to be almost disabled in his behaviour. He'd never have made it into the Marine Corps for training, would he?
That's a criticism that has been made of that movie, and I think probably legitimate. And as far as I know, it's not. I was talking earlier about how Robert Duvall's character in Apocalypse Now was based on a real guy and real incidents. As far as I know, the Pyle character is not based on any real incident that I've come across anyway. So I think it was a dramatic foil for the purposes of the sort of storyline, I think.
Hmm. Patrick, who spoke earlier, said, I was just a kid. Favourite film is Full Metal Jacket and We Were Soldiers.
Yeah.
I just say, Patrick, most service people do have families that are affected by their parents' deployments. So I think it's important that we share family stories as well. Andrew says, I was born in 1956. I can distinctly remember the TV news upset me so badly when I was a boy. At first, Dad didn't realise, but when he saw me quietly shaking with tears, he turned the TV off.
Well, see, I was born. I'm 3 years younger than you, then Patrick. I was born in '59, and so probably because I was too young, I was a little bit younger. I have vivid images in my head of the black and white TV in the corner of the room, which sometimes I would have to stand with the aerial when the football was on for my dad, stand with the aerial to try and get a picture. But I have vivid memories of, just guys lying down, shooting in the jungle, and this being on almost night after night. It seemed to. So those pictures have stayed with me from about the age of 7, 8 onwards, and I don't remember being traumatized by them or upset at the time, probably because I was just too young and stupid and didn't really realize what was going on, or I was distracted or whatever. But they were there. They were images that were fixed in my head from that young age.
So that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because it was the first televised war, wasn't it? And it wasn't necessarily televised in a favourable way, shall we say, obviously with the civil rights going on as well. Whereas if you look at more recent conflicts, the armed services are very keen to control where TV cameras and journalists actually get to, I guess, for obvious reasons. So I think maybe the sort of cultural touchstone that the Vietnam War is in part because it was actually on TV, like night after night, in a way that conflicts before and after really haven't been, have they?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And actually, the reason that they haven't allowed journalists free range since then is precisely because of the Vietnam War. And it goes back to we were talking earlier about where people's attitude was in, let's say, 1965, 66. It was, we're America, we win all the wars we take part in, or at least we get a score draw with North Korea. And and we've got all these resources. We're going to go to Vietnam and it will all be over successfully. And so with, I guess, a degree of hubris, they said, yeah, we've got nothing to hide. Let the journalists, let them go where they want. Let the TV cameras go where they want. In fact, helicopter crews were told they would sometimes kick a soldier off because a journalist wanted to get on to go, and the journalists were told they could go anywhere. They could, wherever the combat zones were, they could go to them. They could do what they wanted. And of course, as the war started to go badly, that was bad news because instead of images of heroism being broadcast back to the American public, it was images of young Americans being killed in this far off land for, possibly a dubious purpose.
Well, devastating footage, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah,
Patrick says, as an Air Force guy later on, Rescue Dawn was good too. Now, I haven't
yeah.
seen that, I don't think.
I think Rescue Dawn was very early as well, and if it's the one I'm thinking of, it involves a pilot who is shot down and escapes with the help of a kind of a Vietnamese woman, a guerrilla woman. And that's a good film, and it was fairly early on. It didn't make much of an impact at the box office, but again, certainly worth a look if you're interested in that aspect of the war.
Andrew goes on to say the 9-year-old girl in the iconic 1972 Napalm Girl photograph is, please forgive me when I actually do this pronunciation, is Fan T. Kim. I don't want to pronounce that surname. I might get it terribly wrong. Taken by Nick Ut on 8th of June 72 in Trang Bang, the Pulitzer Prize winning photo. The terror of war depicts her running naked after a South Vietnamese napalm attack. the image became a powerful symbol of the Vietnam War's devastation. Um, yeah, I quite agree. I've actually got a book. I can't remember his name actually. A black and white Sunday Times photographer who did an awful lot of Vietnam War, and there's some particularly.
Tim Page, not Tim Page. No.
I want to say
Okay.
McLuhan.
Oh, I know who you mean. Yes.
I'm muddling up Marshall McLuhan in my head at the same time, but I could get up and have a look, but I'm wired in, I'm afraid. But yeah, I think images like that obviously had a huge impact, didn't they?
Yeah, yeah, and that I again that now talk about images that traumatize you when you're young. That one I do remember seeing probably when I was in my young teens, and that and just being shocked by it. I can remember seeing it on a newspaper and just staring at it and just the horror of it, and that's it's one of the most famous war pictures ever taken, I think. So yeah, and it puts it into context when when you hear lines like "I love the smell of napalm in the morning."
Yeah, but also in the same film, the horror.
Yeah, completely.
So we are over time, but I want to ask you one more question, Joe. And I also would say there are lots of other Vietnam War films in this book, though please don't think we've by any stretch covered the contents of this book. It's well worth a read. I just want to know, in terms of the films that have made about the Vietnam War during the Vietnam War, what impact have they had on modern war films?
Massive impact, massive impact. We've touched on some of the ways they've impacted modern war films in our discussion today. The authenticity. You don't make a war film now without really going for a sort of a realism, an authentic realism in the way your actors look and feel, the way they're dressed, the way they move. That's become standard now. What was originated by Captain Dale Dye with Oliver Stone in Platoon in '86 has now become absolutely standard. The use of contemporary music in war films. You'll still get some that have an orchestral score, but increasingly people see it as relevant to use the music that the characters in the movie would have been listening to, because we live in an age of music now, particularly with modern. I mean, obviously, you're not going to do that. You're not going to have people in ancient Greece listening to rock songs, but you might have contemporary rock songs as kind of overlaid above the action.
Yep.
So the use of rock and pop and modern music in movies, that's a massive change as well. I think also the fact that war films, if you think that Green Berets in 1968 marks the kind of bookend of that period of World War II, Korean War, one film of the Vietnam War that are all jingoistic. We're the good guys, simple moral binary. Yeah, we're goodies, they're baddies. We want clean cut heroes. Our guys don't do bad things. Well, from 1978 onwards, you get a much more nuanced and subtle view of war films. We start to accept that our guys can do bad things as well. That it's not just the enemy for whom the exigencies of war can turn them into monsters temporarily, or that we sometimes not guys doing their best are fighting for a cause that their political leaders maybe shouldn't be sending them there to fight. To all those sort of things, they're now in all the modern war films. If you look at films about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, none of them resemble a World War II film. They'll have scenes that do. They'll have dramatic battle scenes and whatever, and they'll have heroism, but they will always have that nuance in there as well.
I mean, Warfare, which is about Fallujah, wasn't it? It's a Special Force SEALs team. I mean, that is quite a remarkable piece of filmmaking, I think.
Yeah, yeah. There's some incredible ones. Even the film that was out last year, Civil War, about an imagined civil war in America, that was influenced by Apocalypse Now in particular. So yeah, the influence is all there, I think. And if you watch modern war films, bearing in mind some of these points, you start thinking, okay, I'm taking this for granted, but actually, this wouldn't have happened before 1978.
Yeah. Well, on that note, are you writing any more books, Joe?
Well, I'm hoping that my publisher, Pen and Sword, I like this idea of looking at military history, which is my main interest, through the lens of popular culture because of my background in film and TV. So I'm interested in doing a book similar to Vietnam on the big screen. I'm interested in doing Iraq and Afghanistan on the big screen because a lot of films have been made about those wars, and again, they sort of how they've approached it differently as time goes by is very interesting, and also how they differ from earlier wars is very interesting. So that's one idea I'm hoping to get going on fairly soon.
I suppose what's interesting about those recent conflicts, I mean, they run in parallel, of course, is obviously Afghanistan was America's longest war after the Vietnam War, and the Vietnam War was quite a long war. It kind of, a short war like the Falklands, for example, not much changes culturally or news-wise or in society in the space of, it was, obviously longer than this, but the main combat fighting was like 6 to 8 weeks on the
Mhm.
Falklands itself. When you have a war that lasts 20 years, a lot changes, doesn't it?
Yeah, and what you realize, especially in something like Afghanistan or Vietnam, is you can see the kind of shifting tectonic plates of society.
Yeah.
And there goes back to what we were saying earlier, which is a point you made, which I think is a really, really perceptive point, which is those shifting tectonic plates influence what's happening in the war, and then what's happening in the war, it filters back in and helps change society as well. So it's quite where the balance of weight is and who's influencing who is hard to say because it becomes circular, but absolutely fascinating.
Mm. Shows the power of film, of course,
Indeed.
which is a good point to end on, I think. Joe, thank you so much. That's been absolutely fascinating. If you want to get a hold of a copy of Joe's book, I'm sure it's available in lots of places, but it's definitely available on the Pen and Sword website. If you're in the UK, I'm sure platforms like Amazon will have it if you're overseas, the US particularly. Joe, thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks to all your audience and those who asked questions.